Hello everybody, and welcome to another video on Blood Brothers. This one resumes on page 31. Having just met Mickey and Edward aged 7 together for the first time, we're now about to meet the character of Sammy as well. He's been discussed in the previous section, but now we actually meet him. And a reminder, you should have had now some notes with key quotations and points on Mickey and Edward from the previous section, so now you'll need to be adding to the notes that you will have started on Sammy in this section as well. It's also worth saying about Sammy that with his tendency towards criminality, he represents another of Willie Russell's points about working class people, which is to say that according to Russell, they are only ever a step away from the desperation that will drive them towards crime. This is where I think some of Russell's points start to become a bit more problematic, because manifestly many of us would of course be able to argue that that is not the case for all people of the working class, but nonetheless that's something that Willie Russell seems to imply, and when Mickey is himself driven to crime later, it seems to support that point. At any rate, Sammy leaps in front of them, gun in hand, pointed at them. Two things there. First of all, you recall that we said that Mickey first appears holding a gun, and Sammy similarly. It's interesting because it reminds us of the bond between them, but once again, it reminds us of the fate that will come. It's a very early piece of foreshadowing of their eventual fates, which in both cases will involve firearms. Also worth looking at his movement there, the fact that he leaps out. We get the sense of the sort of violence and the slightly uncontrolled behaviour from Sammy that builds upon the picture that we had before. Mickey says, "Hiya, Sammy." Sammy says, "Give us a sweet." Mickey lies and says, "Haven't got any." Again, we see sort of evidence of his streetwiseness, in contrast to Edward, who says, "Yes, you have," then gives the game away. Mickey frantically shakes his head, trying to shut Edward up. But Edward, again, in his naivety, says, "Yeah, I gave you one for Sammy, remember?" Sammy laughs at Edward's voice and Mickey's misfortune. "You little robbing get." Once again, notice his language, that use of that epithet "get" as an insult, and so on. He says, "No, I'm not." He hands over a sweet. "Anyway, you pinched my best gun." It's a reminder about the link between Sammy and criminality. If you think back even to the "I Wish I Was Our Sammy" poem, he talks about robbing Mickey's toy car. So again, we can group that, the idea of Sammy the robber, Sammy the criminal. Mickey tries to snatch the gun from Sammy, but Sammy is too fast. It's a reminder that right from an early age, Mickey is always one of the weaker and more vulnerable ones in a sort of cruel society that does not support the weaker members of it. Sammy says, "It's last anyway. It only fires caps. I'm going to get a real gun soon. I'm going to get an air gun." Once again, foreshadowing of the association between Sammy and firearms. And he goes into a fantasy shootout. He doesn't notice Edward, who has approached him and is craning to get a close look at his head. It's another payoff now, isn't it, from the earlier sort of setup for the joke, for the spas that Willie Russell had about the plate in Sammy's head. Sammy eventually notices and says, "What are you looking at?" Edward says, "Pardon?" Mickey introduces him and says, "That's Eddie. He lives up by the park. He's a frigging poshy." Again, consider the sort of working class status and the aggression that's suggested by Sammy's language. Mickey says, "No, he's not. He's my best friend." Sammy snorts and decides it's not worth the bother. "You're soft. You're just soft little kids." In quiet disdain, he moves away. Consider, again, the sort of premature aging. You've got Sammy, who's not that much older, and yet he thinks that he's so much more superior. It's yet another sort of example of that theme of sort of premature aging associated with members of the working class. Mickey says, "Where are you going?" Sammy looks at Mickey and says, "I'm going to do another burial. Me worms have died again." Now, a couple of things then there. Once again, we've got an early association of Sammy with death, which again foreshadows to later. But also, what we can say is that in the casual tone which he makes that statement, again, we're almost into sort of a psychopathic lack of consideration. He has no remorse for the fact that they've died. And Mickey, excitedly to Edward, says, "Oh, you coming to the funeral? Our Sammy's having a funeral. Can we come, Sammy?" Sammy puts his hand into his pocket and brings forth a handful of soil. "Look, they was alive and wriggling this morning, but by dinner time they was dead." Again, just linking to what we were saying earlier about the casual cruelty. The way that Mickey gets excited, by the way, there about Sammy's actions, I think again very much links to what we were saying earlier about the for the way that Sammy is actually the nearest thing that Mickey has to a male role model, and of course how that in itself is problematic because of what Sammy is like as a character. Mickey and Edward inspect the deceased worms in Sammy's hand. Mrs. Johnston enters. "Mickey?" Edward says, "Is that your mummy?" "Ma'am." Once again, note the juxtaposition in language. "This is my brother." Now there's some dramatic irony for you, isn't it? Mrs. Johnston is stunned and says, "What?" "My blood brother, Eddie." Eddie who?" "Edward Lyons, Mrs. Johnston," says Edward as he introduces himself, and Mrs. Johnston stands still, staring at him, stunned, because she never hoped that she would see this child again. She can't believe it. But ultimately, it is, in a sense, fateful. The idea that these twins were separated, it was always the case that sooner or later they were going to be reunited. Mickey introduces him and says, "Eddie's my best friend, ma'am. He lives up by the park." And Mrs. Johnston says, "Mickey, get in the house." "What?" "Sammy, you and all. Both of you get in." "But I'm older than him." "I don't have to." I said, "Get, the pair of you." And it's interesting because this is the first time that we've really seen strictness from Mrs. Johnston. This is the first time that we've ever really seen her attempt to exert some control over her children. Why? Because of fear, because of guilt. She does not want the party to come through. She does not want it to result in their deaths. And it's also about her guilt. She tries to suppress her own guilt for what she did. So Mickey goes almost in tears. Again, in a sense, we talked about Edward being lonely, but in a sense, there's an element of that with Mickey too, because he is slightly singled out from his siblings by the greater attention that Mrs. Johnston pays to him as a result of their guilt. So he's saddened to leave. Mickey exits. Mrs. Johnston shouts, "Sammy!" He says, "Ah." To Edward, I'll get you." Edward, obviously without any understanding of this or the sort of anger and tone that Mrs. Johnston has just deployed, says, "Have I done something wrong, Mrs. Johnston?" She says, "Does your mother know that you're down here?" Edward shakes his head. "And what would she say if she did know?" I think she'd be angry. "So don't you think you'd better get home before she finds out?" "Yes." "Go on then." Edward turns to go, then stops. We see the reluctance. We talked about his loneliness. He's just found a friend. He doesn't want to lose that friend straight away. He says, would it be alright if I came to play with Mickey on another day? Or perhaps he could come to play at my house. Don't you ever come around here again. Ever. Again, it's the strictness that comes from love. He replies, but she shouts, "Ever. Now go on. Beat it. Go home before the bogeyman gets you." Another example there of the sort of superstitions that are referred to, and because they are children, they have the same sort of power over them. as they do over Mrs. Johnston herself. So, as Edward walks towards his home, Mrs. Johnston sings, and it's a reprise of the earlier song on Easy Terms, or The Same Idea, and she sings again, should we meet again, I will not recognise your name, you can be sure what's gone before will be concealed, your friends will never learn, but once we were on easy terms. So I suppose the repetition of that song at this point dials us back into the same feeling of loss that she felt the last time we heard it, which was as she was giving up Edward as a baby. So the use of the song there really sort of taps us into that same emotional vein. Now, at that point, on page 34, we'll hold it there, we'll pause, and then we'll resume in the next video. Thank you very much.